All right, next here we're going to look at the Pythagorean identities. And before we do that, I do want to look at one notation that I want to point out. This is important that you understand this particular notation. If we have a trig function that is squared, we could write that as sine of the angle theta. And if we're squaring the trig function, then we would put parentheses and we would indicate that we're squaring the whole trig function, which basically this means that we would take the sine of our angle, we would get that answer, and then we would square it. Now, we have a shorthand notation for this so that we do not need the parentheses. And the shorthand notation is to simply write sine of theta, and then we kind of indent the square and put it here, and this notation means the sine of theta squared. So once again, we're going to take the sine of the angle and then square that particular answer. So this is the notation here that you typically will see throughout solving problems. Now, realize that if you see sine theta squared this way, then here what this typically is going to mean is you're simply squaring the angle. So that means you would square the angle first, then you would take the sine. And most of the time we're dealing with squaring the whole trig function itself. And this notation here in blue is typically what we're going to use. Now I'll point that out because when we go talking about these Pythagorean identities, we're going to start looking at squaring our trig functions. So if we now look at the particular functions, the Pythagorean identities here are listed. We would have the first one, we're going to have three of them, and one states that sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. And I would start off by memorizing this one, and to kind of see where this one actually comes from, we can kind of relate this to our unit circle. And if we were to draw our right triangle, if we think of this as the unit circle here, we know that we have the radius is 1, and we know this is our x, this is our y, and we know by the Pythagorean identity we have x squared plus y squared equals 1 squared. And if we're thinking about this in terms of our trig functions, sine is our y, cosine is the x, so x squared plus y squared equals 1, so sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1 because we're looking at essentially y squared plus x squared equals 1 squared, and of course 1 squared is also equal to 1. So there's our first Pythagorean identity. The second one is 1 plus cotangent squared is equal to cosecant squared. Okay, and then the third one says that if you take your tangent function squared plus 1, that's going to be equal to secant squared. Okay, so eventually at some point you should memorize all three of these. And again, I would start off with the first one. This one you're going to see a little bit more frequently. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And I'm going to show you in just a minute, if you know the first identity, you can derive and come up with the other two. Now we're going to use these throughout in ways to simplify if we're looking at solving equations, which we'll look at a little bit later on, where we can use this to simplify your trig functions. And again, if you don't memorize the second and third one here, just kind of remember that you'll have a formula sheet that if you see something with a 1 or a cotangent squared or a cosecant squared in the problem, then it's a good chance that it's going to fit one of these Pythagorean identities. So let me show you how we can actually derive these other two from the first one. So if we start with the first identity, which is sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, then if I was to come along here and divide And again, we have an equation. We can think of this dividing both sides of the equation. We're not going to change anything. So if I divide both sides of the equation by sine squared, what do we end up with? Well, for the first one here, sine squared divided by sine squared, that's going to be equal to 1 plus cosine squared over sine squared. And you may want to pause the video here and go back. The previous videos we looked at the other identities. This would be your quotient identity. Cosine over sine is the cotangent, and because they're squared, it would be cotangent squared. And then 1 over sine squared, that would be using your reciprocal, which would be equal to cosecant squared theta. So if you notice here, this is giving us the second identity up here. And all we did was take the first one and divide everything by sine squared. All right, so once again, if we were to take the first one, which was sine squared plus cosine squared, that's equal to 1. And now, instead of dividing by sine squared, what happens if we divide everything by cosine squared? So in doing that, we will end up with sine squared over cosine squared. And we know from our previous identity, sine over cosine is the tangent. And because these are squared, that means we would end up with tangent squared theta plus cosine over cosine. Cosine squared over cosine squared is 1. And then 1 over cosine squared would be another reciprocal, the 1 over cosine. To get rid of the fraction, we could simply write that as secant squared theta. And this gives us the third identity from up here. Tangent squared plus 1 equals secant squared. So in the future, if you're ever taking the test, if you can certainly memorize the first one, you can derive the other two by either dividing by sine squared or dividing everything by cosine squared. So there you have your Pythagorean identities. We will do a little bit with these, and again, the further we go into the semester, we'll add some other things with uh, using the Pythagorean identities. So once again, be very careful again with the notation. This sine squared theta here in blue, that is indicating that the whole trig function is being squared. So that means you would actually take the sine of the angle and then square the answer. And again, start memorizing sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, and then hopefully you can start to memorize the other two as well.